So we've got a wonderful speaker tonight. Come on up, Marissa. I've sat at several tables with her over the years, and she's just got such a strong message, and I'm sure she has a wonderful word to share with you this evening, so please.
Oh, thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to come and share my relationship with my higher power, with my Creator, testimony. And so my name is Marissa. I am an alcoholic. Can you hear me? Okay? Yeah, okay. My sobriety date is October 3rd, 2010, and it is truly by the love and mercy of a loving Creator that I'm alive and sober and standing in here today. I loved the lead-in about all the ways that we come to try to find God, all the things that we have to encounter in our lives in order to find God. And I think God is always there. I think Creator is always there, loving no matter what. There's an old timer in an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that I argue with all the time. Ev and I go and we have to agree to disagree, because he always says that God doesn't go where he's not welcome. He's a gentleman. And I always tell him I'm so grateful that God came to me, even though I was not welcoming at all. I needed him, and I had no idea. And so I had a lot of anger. I had a long-standing resentment against God. And, and it's a very typical story. My childhood is full of, I had the, typical dysfunctional family. There was, in my home, there was a lot of violence. There was mental illness. My brother became schizophrenic when I was 5, and I witnessed a lot of violence. And for the first 10 years of his disease, his mental illness actually kind of mirrors an alcoholic's, and how getting the right help, but how you struggle in the beginning. So growing up, I watched this wonderful, loving man in and out of jails and institutions and hospitals. We'd show up to his house and he'd have blood coming out of his ear, where he'd try to stab the voices. And this is all stuff that I encountered as a child. I watched him. There's a lot of physical violence because of his mental illness. There was, I had a sister who was divorced with 2 kids by the time she was 18 years old. So teen pregnancy is really high where I grew up, and her, marriage ended because of domestic violence. And so I have a nephew that's my age. And because I was the youngest, I was the baby. And there was incest and molestation, and I don't like to go into that part too much, but there was just a lot. There was a lot, and I just remember I have a very specific memory of being 5 years old and thinking, it's me against the world, and I'm going to make it. I have to make it. I have no choice. And I remember as a child, wanting something greater than myself. And I would ask my mom to take me to these churches, and I was out dating churches, having her drive me all around. She was a Catholic, so she's of course away from the church to this day. So she would drive me, and everywhere I went, because I was a precocious little child. I refused to watch, cartoons because they insulted my intelligence. I was really and it was really, I didn't have a lot of friends. I always had my face in a book, so I always thought I was really smarter than everybody else. And, I didn't have a lot of friends. We were the only Mexicans in an all-white neighborhood in a very racist town in Texas. And so, we were too Mexican for the white people and too white for the Mexican people. And so, and I faced a lot of racism in that area. Some of the kids used to handcuff me to fences and take turns beating me up, telling me I deserved it because I was nothing but a dirty Mexican. And so these are the people that I encountered in the churches. And they told me that I was subhuman because I was Mexican, and that God took pity on people like me. And so I was driven away from the churches. And I would hear things too. I would hear, this, this guy that's supposed to be so religious is having an affair with so-and-so. I had big ears back then, and I've always been super nosy, and I'd be like, why, he's not living these principles, right? I was always so pure of heart. And if you're going to do something, you have to do it exactly right, And so I was seeking, and I didn't realize at the time that I really mistook God for his children. And it took me a long time. It wasn't until I came into Alcoholics Anonymous. And I didn't even recognize until I got sober. I'd been sober for a while, and I was listening to this speaker, and the speaker was talking about Bill W.'s spiritual experience. And, one of our founders, and it talks about, in Bill's story, he says, much moved. He was in Winchester Cathedral. He says, much moved, I went outside. And when he says much moved, that was a spiritual experience he had. And then whenever his friend comes to talk to him, and he's starting to think about all of his, religious biases and prejudices, and then he says, and then my mind went back to that time at Winchester Cathedral, and he's thinking about that spiritual experience. And it wasn't until I got into Alcoholics Anonymous that I realized that I had a lot of those similar experiences. I felt something, I knew something, there was something bigger than me. And I just have these beautiful memories of laying outside in my backyard, and I could hear the crickets, and I could hear the train in the background, and I was looking up at the stars, and I felt something move through me. Even as a child, I felt connected to something bigger. And that was something that my soul just connected to, it hooked onto. And I wanted that always, and there was always this feeling of lacking, right? I would get these moments, but all these feelings of lacking. So growing up with all of this dysfunction, with all of these things in my life, I just remember feeling this hollow, this aching, wanting something in my life and not knowing what that was, And at 12 years old, my first love was cigarettes. That first drag of a cigarette, and I was like, oh my God, I'm home. It was like Etta James At Last started playing. I was just like, oh, where have you been my whole life? I quit smoking 10 years ago, and it's still so tough for me. I smoked for 22 years, and I loved every second of it. And but right around that time too, I had my first drink, and when that drink hit my head at 12 years old, and I finally felt, okay, that vice around my heart just let go, and I could finally breathe, and I finally felt okay, And so that was, to me, that was what I had been looking for, and I chased it. I chased it for a long time. I didn't realize all the things I was chasing. I mean, we get told these things, right? I found the boyfriend when I was 14 years old, and, that was our true love, right? The one that's supposed to be the one, and it was always that lacking, And at 14 years old, I got pregnant. And I was supposed to get married. He was a senior, and I was a freshman in high school. It was very common where I grew up. And he had joined the Marines, so I was going to be a Marine's wife. And I remember thinking, finally, something that's going to love me, And my mom was devastated, and she didn't want to have anything to do with me. And so I say that I moved out when I was 14 years old. It wasn't really a choice of mine. And so I moved up to Albuquerque to live with my sister, and 3 days after my 15th birthday, I lost the baby in a hospital in Albuquerque. And I just remember feeling so completely, utterly alone and just wanting something. And that's when my drinking really took off. Between 15 and 20, I moved 30 different places. And the consequences of alcoholism for women is rough, and it's brutal. It is full of so much shame and a lot of times violence. Sexual assault was part of my story by a family member when I was drunk. And I, of course, took that blame on myself. Said it was my fault because I was drunk and I was looking to get drunk. And that feeling of just that toxic shame that somebody taught me about, that I am something bad, and just wanting to feel just okay. And the drink wasn't doing it anymore. Just chasing it. And then, at 20 years old, I got pregnant with my son. I met his dad because his dad told me, you shroom with me, you shroom for free. So, of course, he was my soulmate, right? It was a wild, and my son ended up helping me and his father get our lives together. Like, I finally, like, came to, and I was just like, okay, like, here's this child. And I remember talking to this friend of mine, and years later, you know, talking about the power of prayer. Years later, this woman, she was actually an ex-boyfriend's mother, and she was a very, very devoted Christian. And her and I would have all these arguments about God all the time. And I was talking to her when I was pregnant, and I said, how can I have this baby in this world? And she said, it takes good people having babies in this world to make it a better place. And I just remember and years later when I got sober and I talked to her, she said, I prayed for so many years that you'd be okay. And I really think her prayers worked. And where she was one place where I feel like God showed up in my life. You know, running and gunning all of these years, you know, I had my son. I ended up, that was my first attempt at sobriety, and I was full of terror. I wasn't full of fear, I was full of terror. And it was just horrific. And I tried to hold it together. I tried to be a mom that he would deserve, and then drink time came. And I split with his dad, and I, you know, got together with my first husband, who became my daughter's dad, and tried again. And it was just, you know, I was trying so hard to deserve these children and deserve this life, because we had a really good life. You know, I was assistant coach of my son's soccer team. I was on PTA. I was trying so hard to keep it together, and drink time came. And through all these years, through all of this stuff, you know, it was I look back now, because when I came in 3 years after I divorced, when drink time came after my first husband and we divorced, and 3 years later I wound up in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I always say I thank AA for bringing me to God, and for God bringing me to AA, because I didn't want to have anything to do with God. My anger was so deep towards God. You know, I remember in elementary school, this is in the Panhandle of Texas, they sent me to the principal's office because I refused to stand during the Pledge of Allegiance because they said the word God. Because after all those attempts with church, I was so angry with God. And I was so angry that I was willing to face like physical violence, because in Texas, if they find out you're like that, ooh, they're not nice about that. And so when I came into AA, and I went to my second meeting ever of AA, and they called on me to share, and it was a God meeting. And they called on me, and I said, F your God. What has he ever done for me? That's how much I had closed off to God. And this guy in the meeting, he just started laughing, and he was like, oh, we pick our own conception. I know a guy that prays to George Burns. And I was just like, I thought it was hilarious. I was just like, oh my God, I get to pick my own conception. But that's what opened the door for me a little bit. And I got to start listening. And I started opening my heart a little bit. And all the things that I was just like, no, absolutely not, no. I began to see that God was there all along. My sponsor started pointing that out to me. You know, during all those crazy, insane moments when I was a little girl, I remember all these little moments, right? Like the spiritual moments when in the backyard, or I remember there was this little lady, and she would, on nights that my mom would have to go, you know, to the jails or the hospital, whatever, dealing with my brother, this little lady, Miss Wiley, would take me, and she taught me how to play piano. And she taught me how to play checkers, and she never let me win. She's like, you're going to have to earn that. And that started that competitive streak in me that I have to this day. That's one of my favorite parts about me. I really think that's God-given. And so, but I remember that. I remember a little point like Angela, my boyfriend's mother. You know, that was the boyfriend that I was living with when I had to drop out of school. And she just always showed up to me, was the principles of what Jesus taught. She was the first person that I saw really that she wasn't about telling me about any of it, but she just showed up with it in every aspect of her life. And I was like, I just remember as I was staying sober longer, and that door started to open to an idea of a power greater than myself. And in the beginning, I had what I call starter gods. There was Father Sky and Mother Earth. There was, Sky Daddy. There was, big guy in the sky with the beard, and over time, like, everything changed. And my prayers in AA, as I stayed sober longer, they went from like, I really hope you're there, to you better be there, to today, like, I know you're there. I know you're there. And that was hard. That was really hard. I had to start to let God in. And I feel like God came where he wasn't really wanted at the time. I kept going, yeah, I want to believe in this, but I don't know, like, it's always failed me. Something like this has always failed me. And then without even deserving it, I would get something. I would get some spiritual experience. I missed my favorite story of all, of how I ended up in AA. I had just gone to a therapist to help blame my mother and father for all my problems, and she suggested an AA meeting, so I fired her. I went, how dare you? I am a piece of crap, but I'm not no alcoholic. And so I was gonna go, I had managed to stay sober for a few weeks, and I was gonna go drinking when I couldn't stand it anymore. That vice that sits around your heart and sits on your back and it's around your throat. And I was gonna go drink. I couldn't stand it anymore. And I knew that all the humiliation, everything that went with it, I just didn't care. And for some reason, I stopped by my sister's house with my ex-brother-in-law, and we got locked in the garage. And so, he started talking about economic stimulus package, and then pretty soon he's like, fire and brimstone, second coming of Christ. And I was like, there is no God, there is no God. And he argued with me for 3 hours. We argued, and he finally backed me into a corner, and I said, okay, I don't know if there's a God or not. And I remember I went outside, and I looked up at the stars, where I always feel that, and I said, if there's a God, I want a sign. And I couldn't go to the bar because it was already closed, so I went to school. I was in nursing school, so I went to school the next day because I hadn't been out drinking. And a big PowerPoint at the front of the class, the lecture was on alcoholism and addiction. And I was like, wow, there's some women in here that really need this. And I was like checking all the boxes, and I was just like, yeah, I have this, but I don't think much of that because I was like, last week I had prostate problems. Like, I think I have everything. And I'm like, okay. And then this woman gave her testimony, right? She gave her story, and she had this beautiful light in her eyes. And I was just like, oh, she told my story. And I told my friend Estella at the time, I said, I want your boyfriend to take me to my first AA meeting, and he did. And he was the one who handed me this piece of paper and said, ask this woman to be your sponsor. And I couldn't have done it with any other woman. I really couldn't have. The first thing she said to me is, if I don't teach you God consciousness or God reliance, I'll be doing you a huge disservice, because that's what this is about. And I would tell her all my traumas. If you drank, if you experienced what I did, you would drink like I did, and she would say, I'm sorry that happened to you, but that's not what we're talking about. And she helped me to heal from the bottom up. She helped me to deal with my alcoholism so that way I could come back and heal from those traumas. She helped me to be a little bit more open-minded to God. She helped me learn that God reliance. And she was always so beautiful about it. She was always so kind. She would say, I remember one time I was being so defiant, and I was like, God's not going to take care of this. God's too busy. I need to take care of this. Like, yeah, God's really going to handle this for me. And she said, you better start to pray. And I was like, why? I was so defiant, always. And I remember I went, and she's like, you better pray for humility. And I was like, no, thank you. I don't like that, humility. It always made me sick to my stomach. And so I went to eat with a friend, and she tells me we leave, and she says, thank you for being my friend. And I said, well, of course I'm your friend. Why wouldn't I be? And she said, you don't have to be. And I don't know what it was about that moment, but God rushed into my heart. And I realized that I'm not entitled to the love of my children, the love and forgiveness of my family. I'm not entitled to sobriety. It brought me to my knees. I went into a room, and I got down, and I said, thank you. Thank you for loving me so much that I don't deserve this, but I was brought here. And then I went around to everybody's houses and started thanking them for loving me. And everyone's like, oh God, Marissa's on another one of her things. And to this day, that's what I do. My children who didn't want to have anything to do with me when I first got sober, I waited for them, and I practiced these principles in all my affairs, and they started coming around. And today, my 23-year-old who just got back from South Korea, he's calling me, having conversations with me for hours, talking to me about his philosophies, his life. My daughter, who she's going to RIT, she has this amazing life, and she includes me in it. She wants to include me in it. And I think about wow, that's to me, I think about the way my Creator loves me. I think about that saying on page 25, and there is a solution, which is my favorite reading in the whole book, where it says, God has entered into our hearts and lives in a way which is indeed miraculous. And I remember when my sponsor read that to me, I just it took my breath away, because I felt something sprout in my heart, and I felt it start to grow. And I feel that. That's what when I think about the love that Creator shows to me, and that patience and that unconditional love, and I think, why can't I show that to others? Why can't I'm overflowing with it today. And that's what AA has given to me. And I'm able to be, sometimes I've had really hard times in sobriety. And then I think about my children, they have that one person in this world that they know loves them unconditionally. And just like I know that I have something in this world that loves me unconditionally, no matter what. Women like me don't get sober. When I was running and gunning, one time I was joking around, I'm going to finish up here. One time I was joking around with I was talking to my son. I was arguing with him. He was a teenager. And I said, kid, you don't want to end up like me. I should be dead or in a Mexican prison. And he was like, I want to hear that story. I was like, oh, it's a saying we have in AA. Oops. I'm always asking people to say that. So I'm not a liar. But, that's really, it's the truth. And the amount of damage, the wreckage that I was feral while I was out there. But all I ever knew was trauma and pain. It was me against the world. And so I had to think about my survival at any cost. And so, when I came in here and you told me that those behaviors were character defects, when I came into Alcoholics Anonymous and you told me those were character defects, and that I could trust some sky daddy that was going to meet all these needs so I didn't have to manipulate them out of others, I thought you were crazy. But then that sponsor who helped me walk through that and just let go. And I began to see that my needs were, overflowing, met. And all these things, I didn't have to lie and manipulate, and I could just be love in people's lives. And it was, I'm not always perfect at it. I am human, but that's the point. That leaves so much room for this Creator that I'm convinced is absolutely in love with me. Absolutely in love with me. Because I shouldn't be here. Women like me don't get sober. They don't get the life that I have today. The opportunities that I get, I see my life as a nurse going out into this community. I see that as an opportunity. What I get when I help these people, the relief that I see in their eyes, the love that I'm able to share with them, I'm like, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to do this. Honestly, it sounds really cheesy, but it just floors me, the life that I have today because of Alcoholics Anonymous, which brought me to a loving Creator. And so I'll always be grateful. I'll always say yes anytime I have to. Sometimes I feel like a schoolgirl that has a crush on God. I'm just like, have you heard of him? He's actually really great. But, any chance that I have to share that story because of my deep, deep resentment with God, because I closed all the doors and God came in anyway. Because yes, I think God's a gentleman, but I also think God is merciful and loving and all-knowing. And so despite all of that, despite all of the bad behavior, God has still given me just such a wonderful life. So I was taught gratitude is a verb. And today I show that gratitude by being of service to all of God's children in and out of the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, and by enjoying this gift, by enjoying this life. And and every once in a while, I'll sit there and go, I don't know, God, I really need you. And it's really crazy, but I'll hear that sound of a train off in the background, and I go, there you are, thank you. All right, thank you for allowing me to share.
Marissa, thank you so much. You blessed us with that story. Another hand for Marissa. Yeah. I'm astounded by the power of our good God. How do we go from A to here? How do we get there? And it's often through pain, right? And I heard you talk about the cartoons and how that insulted your intelligence, and that's how I felt about the Bible. When that's ridiculous, that's preposterous, that can't possibly be true, right? I was an unforgiving person. I couldn't fathom the type of forgiveness that grace offers us, And we're kind of talking about, before we walk into the supper part of our service, I just wanted to give you a bit of a word because I've been thinking about this idea that we talk a lot about my problem. All right, my problem is powerlessness, right? Hopefully we all sort of acknowledge that our problem is powerlessness, and it's easy to express that in us, and sometimes it might be easier to see it from a different perspective. And so this is from Matthew. Jesus heals a boy possessed by an impure spirit. When they came together, the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing with them about?" he asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not do it." So that kid's me. But I'm also this guy. "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, the spirit in the boy, it threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like that?" See, I'm also the father, right? "From childhood," he answered. It often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." Jesus asked incredulously, "If you can?" said Jesus. Everything is possible for the one who believes." And the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my disbelief." And that's where I think I sit at step 2, right? There's something, I can't do anything about my kid, I can't do anything about my situation, I can't do anything about the world, but apparently this guy can. Everyone's coming to this guy, and all he's saying is, everything is possible if you only believe. And so we come to believe. We share a word of prayer. Join your hearts with mine. Jesus, we are all, at some point in our individual faith journeys, like this saved little boy's father, aren't we? We realize we have a problem that is far outside of our power and influence, outside of our control, to do anything about it. Like a desperate person, we turn to a new option, God, you. Jesus, for those of us who confess you as Savior, please strengthen our faith. For those of us who are just beginning to sense your presence and power, call out to us. For those of us coming to believe, help us to surrender and chase after your goodness. Jesus, heal us, reconcile us, restore in us health and sanity.